Hi, everybody. We're excited to have this panel. Really, continual steps for developing indoor farming. So, of course, it's a big subject. There's a lot of material, different directions we can go with this conversation. We're going to focus especially on the values that indoor farming provides to humanity, to the industry, to food production, some of the trends and challenges that we see the industry potentially facing and experiencing. Automation will also be something we'll discuss. And then we're going to finish it off with some discourse about recent developments within the space and asking the very tough question to all of our panelists of looking in their crystal ball and predicting the future, which is something that I hope the audience doesn't hold against if any of us get it wrong, because it's a very challenging thing to do. So with that said, I want to give each of our panelists to introduce themselves, talk about the work they're doing briefly, their background in CEA, and then if they can finish off their introduction with how they define indoor farming. Sometimes the definition can get a little wobbly within the space and change based on person or parties. So with that said, Mark, I would love to start with you.
Sure. I promise I'll keep my introduction fairly brief, because anybody who's been here at the event throughout the previous 2 days already knows exactly who I am and has seen me talking a great deal. So I'll try to keep it relatively short. But yeah, I'm the founder and chairman of UK Urban Agritech, which is an industry association based in the UK, obviously, and looking at the UK market around sort of urban ag tech, urban farming, controlled environment agriculture. Again, you're going to come into that question of definitions to a certain extent, but it's there. And like a lot of industry associations, and another one that you'll hear about momentarily, no doubt, we work in that sort of pre-competitive space, areas of common interest across the industry, education, workforce development, policy, these kinds of questions, right? It's the rising tide that lifts all ships. And I think that's probably, I guess I've been at this now for nearly 10 years, God help me. And I think, those are sort of the recurring themes that just keep coming up again and again. And I think we'll probably end up talking about them quite a lot during this session, so I won't go into too much detail there. In terms of how I define indoor farming, I think it is a pretty broad church. I think, it can cover anything from at one end, kind of polytunnels, right up to kind of, high-tech kind of indoor vertical farming, right through to, like these sort of vats full of growing bacteria and things like that. It's all ultimately indoor farming, so there's a pretty big spectrum there.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Tinia, I would love to pass it along to you for your introduction.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks to Jonathan for having me here today. So my name is Tinia Pina. I'm the founder and CEO of Re-Nuble, and at Re-Nuble, we take raw materials that are organic and renewable from crop residue, as well as sterilized vegetative waste streams. And we turn that into a platform of sustainable technologies or inputs, namely for CEA, but has also extended into open field traditional agriculture as well. My technical background is not a biologist. It's not a agronomist by any means. It was purely developed from the passion of wanting to really just introduce more sustainability, namely in urban areas. And that's really extending it to more of a circular kind of approach. So I got into this just out of curiosity. And I say that intentionally because we do need more people with various really diversified backgrounds to provide perspective and innovation within our industry. So how I define indoor farming, and I like to have a little bit more of a positioning difference because it is so broad, but I do think that it's really important that we make it relatable and have urgency into our market and our audience. But I say it as indoor farming is the practice of growing food and non-edible crops in a controlled environment, often using resource-optimized methods that is protected from the erratic weather patterns and persistent disease and pest issues that traditional soil farming currently faces. So if we do this right, then hopefully we can be more collaborative with open field farmers and really kind of share the insights, the best practices across both industries. So thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. My name is Andrew Lloyd. I'm Deputy CEO at IGS. I'm 2.5 years into this industry. I spent the previous 3.5 decades in the global IT business. By background, I am an electrical and electronic engineer. That probably speaks very much to IGS's position in the market. We are, broadly speaking, technologists. So we fuse together over a dozen different engineering and science disciplines to make a product we call a growth tower, a vertical farm perhaps, or a vertical farming machine. It comes in 3 heights, 6, 9, and 12 meters high. And by and large, we spent the last 3 years taking that product to market. We're just ticked by 10 years old as a business. We spent the first 7 years on a journey from a mad science project into launching a commercial product that we've now successfully sold across 4 continents. We allow our customers, principally farmers, to grow a range of crops. We've grown over 200 different crops, including food crops. Most of this market, I would say, is known for its leafy greens. We'll talk more later about that, but my firm conviction is that the future of this industry goes well beyond leafy greens. We've had great success of late, for example, in non-food crops, including growing tree seedlings for forestry. I completely endorse what's been said by Tinia earlier regarding her definition on indoor farming. Perhaps give you a slightly outside-in perspective. Indoor farming also allows farmers to grow in places and in climates that haven't been grown in before, to deliver more locally, supporting a deglobalization, increased crop diversity, so growing stuff more locally, reducing the food miles in particular associated with dragging stuff from the other side of the planet. Hopefully to do so in a more sustainable way, and whether you measure sustainability in terms of CO2 emissions or water usage or what you do to the soil, and with a people intensity that makes sense to the locality that it's being done in. People obviously cost money, different amounts of money around the world. People tend to compromise a biosecure environment and bring disease and bacteria with them. So there's always a balance to be struck there with the cost of deploying automation within these indoor farming environments. But I completely agree with the perspective that this supplements, augments, complements traditional farming. We are not going to be feeding the world by completely moving everything indoors. So the real challenge is, how do we use climate change and indoor farming techniques to get the most out of agriculture that's already out there, including perhaps using slightly longer growing seasons to get more harvests, both indoors and outdoors during the growing year.
Well said. Thank you, Andrew. Tom, if you wouldn't mind giving an intro and your definition.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. And very pleased to be part of this discussion here. My name is Tom Zollner. I'm the Secretary General and co-founder of Farm Tech Society. We are trying to be a sectorial representation. I purposely say not industry association, because the industry is agriculture. But I like to see the difference to the sector, that it is defined what I call, or what it would be starting to really define in the typology and in the narrative as controlled environment agriculture, CEA short. And, that's also really a bit what I understand under indoor farming. I mean, we struggle as an emerging sector to define what do we do, how we do it, and what do we call it. And this is kind of our role to do a few things on behalf of this sector, this emerging sector, who's really very interestingly, fueled by people like Tinia and Andrew, to come from outside of agriculture. I mean, I have a trajectory of 35 years in agriculture, and only in the last 10 years I've seen really younger people from different sectors actually actively entering agriculture as a profession, which, to us, we should be completely thankful that this is really happening. We should also make sure that these people are not going to leave us after a few years of very disappointing experiences, because obviously agriculture is a very difficult and sort of old-fashioned undertaking. Now, we're based in Brussels, but we have members in North America and also in Africa, as well as in Europe. We like to see that the sector can rally under an inclusive umbrella of farm tech society being addressing all sorts of activity under this controlled environment system. And that means it could be, as was said before, some low-tech applications to a very high-tech sort of fully automated, autonomous growing, which is a bit controversial to say that, but we've come a long way. I mean, if you really look at IGS has been doing, and also the products that Tinia is developing, it's actually amazing how leapfrogging our sector has actually moved forward in a very relatively short period of time with interesting proposals, solutions, and actual useful ideas for the industry. However, the industry does not really see us that well. It doesn't really understand. I mean, conventional agriculture is almost suspiciously thinking that we're making so much noise that we are trying to we want them to share their subsidy pie with us, which obviously would make a lot of sense. But they're not willingly give up any kind of subsidy unless they see the actual benefit of sharing. And so there is that narrative issue to be solved. There is that typology to be solved, but we're well on the way. FarmTech is now only 5 years old, and we've grown significantly, doubled our membership every year. Hopefully continue doing that. We're riding on this wave of what I call the perfect storm in agriculture, meaning, the challenges are just seriously unsurmountable for many farming communities around the world, whether they are in Africa, in Asia, in North America, in Europe. It's really entering the same level of deprivation of access to new solutions, support, knowledge transfer, technology, etc., etc. And all of them fight really an uphill battle on many fronts. It's not just climate change, geopolitical events, kind of a misperception also what agriculture really supposed to do, and also consumer ignorance towards the fact that this is a really vital and very important industry. It needs to be really well taken care of, but also it's the other way. It's also important to have us really explain to the stakeholders what do we do and what we don't do, because that's very unclear. And I'm really grateful for this panel because we can hopefully lift a little bit of that mystery about what do we do and what we don't do.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. So now we're gonna start to talk about the value we provide, and I want to start with you, Tinia. What value does, and I think through our definitions, I'm going to almost combine some terms here. We're calling this indoor farming. Let's call it CEA. I think it encompasses a lot more than what we're talking about. It's a bit more broad, let's say. Some people maybe limit indoor farming to strictly warehouse or vertical farm. So after hearing your definitions, I just want to maybe say we're going to talk CEA especially. So Tinia, what can you tell us about the values that this industry provides?
Yeah, so we're based in New York City, but we have manufacturing in upstate New York. And in upstate New York, especially, we're limited to about 6 months of just consistent time to be able to produce. And that's in the traditional kind of open field setting. So I know for a fact, in New York State, where we're committing a lot of resources to see how we can extend their year-round crop production of these farms, we're trying to find ways where some of the, especially in, we've spoken with a lot of like hospitality, schools, they're sourcing commodities or produce from California, namely, they want to be able to access it more closely. So that is a shorter supply chain and distribution that's wanted to be had there. And then third is there's value in what is a need for just general workforce development, to a lot of the same points that Thomas mentioned earlier. There's an opportunity for a lot of skill sets based on a different diversified crop type, and that introduce more research and development capabilities that can be extended into food tech and biotech. So I think the fact that, if I were to summarize in 3 main key points, workforce development opportunities, shorter supply chain, and 3, just more resilient, dependable, but predictable food production that's closer to the consumer. I think that's the most immediate measurable examples. I hope that in the near future we can really reliably and with valid research speak to more of the nutritional density claims that I think would give us a lot more strength in the benefits that we could provide to the industry and the consumer, more importantly.
I mean, great breakdown. And I think that it's exactly as the industry develops, the nutrient density is such a great point that maybe isn't first coming to mind with our industry, at least with public perception. And you really hit on one of my favorite values, is the extending of the grow season, just making it so some of these, northern New York crops that might not be available for a portion of the year is now available. I mean, it's a foodie's dream to be able to get, a very delicious ripe tomato in the middle of the winter time, when usually that's not an option with, let's say, more conventional practices. So that's a great breakdown. Mark, would love to hear your insight, your opinions about the value that, let's say, CEA provides. I think you're muted, Mark.
Honestly, I was bound to do it eventually. 2 days of this conference,
I'm gonna do it.
I managed not to do it, and I finally did it. It had to happen eventually. Yeah, I guess it was going to be, to pick up on a couple of points that Tinia said. It's the consistency. That's the thing, right? There's a lot of things that this technology can do, whether you're aiming towards sort of a nutritional benefit, or whether you're aiming towards an educational benefit, or some climatic thing, or you're looking to hybridize with other types of growing and do propagation or new variety development. You have to, there's almost too many to decide what, to just declare there's a sort of set value to this thing. But it's that consistency. Whatever it is you decide to do, if you do it well and you get it right, you can do it the same every time. And that's what really separates us from kind of, traditional agriculture, right? Traditional agriculture is a thing of many, many variables, and it can do amazing things, but that consistency is difficult. And in a world of climate change and supply chain shocks and whatever else, that's going to get harder and harder to achieve that consistency. And then the other piece of it is resilience, right? That at the moment we have, our food systems are based on this kind of just-in-time principle, right? That everything will happen exactly when it is supposed to happen. And, I take nothing away from it. It is an astonishing thing when you think about it, that we manage to get food on our plates every evening. And, you can just wander into a supermarket in December in Scotland and go, I want tomatoes, and I can have tomatoes, and that's the thing, right? But ultimately, we're now getting to a point where that might not be possible that much longer through conventional agriculture. And there are myriad other challenges and issues. And I think, so that consistency of whatever it is you're trying to do, and the resilience that enables by building layers into the system, so that you're not just always relying on one thing, and if that breaks, you can't have it, right? It builds strength in depth. And I think that's really the key to what we can do.
Yeah, I like the idea of the resilience, and I'm really happy you used that word consistency, because often we have controlled environment agriculture, CEA, but I also think that C is interchangeable with consistency. So when you think of CEA, the C can also be consistency, because we talk about, yes, the consistency of having available crops, but also the consistency of quality is another thing that's a huge value that we're able to provide. Tom, would love to hear your points on the value our industry provides.
Well, I beg to differ a little bit on these points, because the proof in the pudding in agriculture is when really conventional farmers are uptaking these innovations, and of course I think the best value I see for the foreseeable future that CA can provide is, we're taking risks to try out new things. We try to prove it. We try to figure it out. And we can actually play around with some things that the normal farmer doesn't even think about it, because it's just too risky to even do anything. I mean, just whatever works, and I'm not going to touch it. And of course, that is now the dilemma of the whole industry, because whatever used to work is not working anymore. So they were looking around for solutions, and now we're there as the new kids on the block with some really great ideas, but we still haven't been able to actually prove that we are giving consistent quality. We are there, year round. I mean, let's look at the greenhouse evolution, and this is a good thing because they're sort of the most mature part, I call it, in our CEA world. But they have been really leapfrogging early on when it was really kind of like a lot of experimental things were taking place, and then it was adopted and it was proven to be good. But lately they've kind of resorted to almost small scale incremental improvement of an existing system, and they've been also almost suspicious what a vertical farm can do on top of what they already figured out in a greenhouse. And so there is that really interesting debate and recognition for the new kind of sort of risk-taking, innovative approach by the new type of farmer tech supplier from this control environment, a group of innovators who can actually then really engage with conventional farmers and really have an impact on how we're going to grow it in the next 10 years. And I by no means know how this will happen, but I do see that we have this opportunity now because the challenges are gigantic. Nobody has any good solutions. And we could actually really raise our hands like, you can try this.
Yeah. And I like the idea of not separating portions of the industry or saying this versus that or that versus this. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a goal in mind, especially with our conversation, is producing food, let's say. I know there's other crops and, we can talk about cannabis or floriculture, but let's say the goal here is producing food. And I think that a lot of the value lies in us working together. Maybe it's a greenhouse and a vertical farm working together. Maybe there's a vertical farm that's doing high quality germination for field production. Maybe the greenhouse is doing the same thing. So I think it's very important to look at this as a true melting pot of different technologies, different solutions. So well said there, Tom. Andrew, why don't you finish us off with the category of values?
So Kyle, firstly, I'm going to endorse the comment you made right at the end. I think one of the key values of CEA, and I commented on in my introduction, is how it augments or complements traditional farming. And I completely believe that CEA has got a role to play around providing consistent, vibrant, quality starter plants for planting out, whether they are in other forms of CEA, so what I call horizontal towers and the rest of the world calls glass houses, polytunnels, fields, forests. In terms of values, it probably depends whose value or problem you are solving. We've touched on it in a few of the answers already. At a government level, government has a commitment to its citizens to provide what it likes to call food security. The problem, of course, is when it becomes food insecurity. And I live in the UK, and we had a bit of that earlier in the year, both with inflationary price rises. Inflation of food is running at a 45-year high here, a little bit over 19%, and various crops are not available. So to Mark's point earlier, we have got used to getting tomatoes and cucumbers in February, but not this February. It didn't quite happen. At a community level, in terms of if you're looking at a whole community, we've talked already about wanting nutritious produce for individuals to consume and probably specific demographics within there. So how do we give growing kids better nutrient? How do we give them better food habits for life? How do we feed people in hospitals so that they get better faster through eating healthier foods rather than just necessarily just relying upon pharmaceuticals and good care? How do we make it affordable for consumers? We've talked already probably quite a bit about farmers, but farmers clearly are part of the mix here. And what does a farmer really want? Well, he or she wants to be able to consistently grow great plants and make money. What they all should have more of an interest in, and if they join their forces better, which perhaps is where some of the data science opportunity within CEA is really going to come to the fore, is in dealing with waste. If CEA has the promise for the first time in human history of giving a farmer perfect control over the weather and the number of hours of sunshine in the day, then why grow a crop? Why burn a kilowatt hour of energy that there is no confirmed demand for? So, cutting out waste across the whole value chain, yes, from the consumer's refrigerator back to the farm, and how do you ensure that you minimize the amount of wasted crop that is grown, wasted crop in the value chain, wasted crop ultimately in the consumer's refrigerator. So waste, I think, is a value we're going to end up talking a lot more about across the whole value chain.
Yeah, no, I mean, well said. And I think when we talk about waste and just values in general, the last thing I'll stress before we move on to challenges is the importance of really looking at the data when we define these things. Is we need to be honest as an industry and really be critical of our own data to say, hey, what does our waste look like? What does our energy use look like? And that's going to be my segue into, let's say, the challenges. And I'm actually want you to continue what you've been saying, Andrew, and kind of fold into the challenges of the industry. I think that'll be a nice segue. So what challenges do you see, just CEA in general? What are some of our key challenges that we're experiencing right now and that we may experience in the future?
Well, probably the biggest elephant in the room in most Western markets is the price of a kilowatt hour of electricity or a therm of gas. And so let's not duck that, which really gets me back to the previous point I just made. If you are going to invest in a therm of gas or a kilowatt hour of electricity, clearly we can talk about the sustainability of that in terms of where's that flow of electrons coming from? Is it coming from a dirty coal-fired power station, or is it coming from a solar PV array or a nice wind turbine that sits on the hill beyond me here? But in terms of, they all cost money. So are you making wise use, very efficient use of those kilowatt hours? Clearly access to talent, the people that are going to be needed, whether it is inside a vertical farm, inside a high-tech greenhouse or otherwise, is a challenge in some markets, less so in others. Some of those people are more expensive in some markets than in others. The role of those people in farming going forward, and we'll perhaps come to this later, what does really a digital farmer do? And that will change over time. But right now, biggest single challenge that we see is both the current price of a kilowatt hour, and I think the other component is what the last year or so has shown us is that people, for the first time in many people's careers, are really having to deal with significant inflation and the volatility of both inflation and the price of energy. So I have spent, as I disclosed earlier, 3.5 decades since I left college, and that makes me quite old. But for most of that career, inflation is not something I've had to worry about. Inflation and the gap between the farm gate price and the consumer price, and how quickly does a inflationary input ripple through to the price I can charge to my off-taker customer and onwards to the consumer. How fast does that ripple go? My observation is right now probably not fast enough for most farmers. And as a result, you see even CEA greenhouses that close down over winter that may never reopen again. So the mix of where agriculture is being done has changed and arguably is changing. And back to the point that Mark made earlier, it may well be that we're not going to have cucumbers in February again. So for me, by far the biggest thing is the price of energy. Clearly, there are other things in the perfect storm, and I'm acutely aware, having seen some of the questions, that I don't wish to be a doom monger around climate change. I think there are opportunities around climate change, but we do need to take it seriously. It is changing the way in which food is grown around the world. It is changing where food is grown around the world, and whether it's too much water, too little water, too much heat, not enough soil, all of those things come into play. But fundamentally, the biggest single challenge, and I'll leave the rest to everybody else, is the price of energy.
What I love about what you said is, we talk energy, talent, inflation, climate change, and those are some of the biggest challenges we're facing globally in every dimension, in every industry. And what's also interesting about it is if you look at each of these things, energy, talent, inflation, climate change, what's special is CEA is a potential solution as well to all of those things. Now, maybe vertical farming is a much more energy demanding right now, but I think a lot of these things in the long run will eventually be some of the tools in the toolbox to be a solution to those problems.
So I agree. The opportunity and challenge there is how do we get it to industrial scale fast enough so that it can intercept the future of food challenge.
Well said. Tom, what would you like to add to the discussion as far as challenges?
Well, interestingly, all these challenges obviously provide certain opportunities, in some ways. I mean, we've seen also people who invested into energy efficiency, and they are now have no problem with the kilowatt price. But what I would like to also focus on that all these ideas we can develop around the challenges of how to overcome are not going to be any meaningful unless we also engage with the regulators and actually have them understand what are we doing here. And as a practice, CEA has been completely invisible to regulators, and this, whatever reason for that is, there's another story for another day. We do have this real obstacle who will make it really difficult for any of these opportunities to really scale. Talking energy, right? I mean, Andrew, you mentioned this. I mean, to really have the same level playing field as other industry, partners have on, let's say, on a manufacturing comparison level, would be something we should really look at as a sector, right? Because without that, you will be always left alone, try to negotiate the best possible deal, get as efficient as possible. And this is the farmer's dilemma, of course. It's also a sector or an industry which is very poorly represented. I mean, it's really dominated by commodity growing, and everything in between is basically non-existent for most governments and regulators. However, we have a lot of visibility and we have a lot of interesting ideas here. And I think this engagement with the regulators is going to be super key to really pay a lot of attention, whether you're a startup, whether you're an SME, whether you're a grower, whether you're a tech supplier, because without that engagement, nothing will ever really bear fruit, in my view. I mean,
no,
this is not.
And Tom, I want to ask you. I mean, I love this subject of the regulators, and in my experience, I've seen them perk up with, let's say, food security. Is the idea that
Right.
this industry can provide food security for their country? All of a sudden, it's like this national security. Oh wow, that's powerful for my citizenship. What, in your opinion, when you work so much with that side of the business, what do you see really perks up regulators? Like, as an industry, what having regulators focus on, having our politicians look at, which in your opinion will garner the most interest and the most impact?
No, without a doubt, it will be the workforce, the job we can create. I mean, it's really, to me, the best political capital we could really gain by making regulators understand how much of an interesting career we can provide, even on a blue collar level. And not just talking about all these engineers and IT people and plant physiology and whatever. I mean, we have in R&D, we have already a very nice track record of really creating high-paying, interesting job careers. But what really any regulator wants to hear of any proposal for anything to adopt is how many jobs are you going to create and how long will they stick around? And this is for me the key to open that door and to get into food security or nutrition. I mean, the pandemic, everybody is now really convinced that diabetes B is not a treatable disease. It needs to be prevented. And how do you prevent diabetes B? Well, it's very simple. Everybody knows it's nutrition. All these arguments, they are obviously very powerful, but none of the regulators actually feel that this is giving them the right ammunition to make it really a big difference in terms of revisiting these regulations. And regulations are regulations. I mean, agriculture is one of the most regulated sectors or industries in the world. I mean, rightly so, but also there's a huge resistance on trying to do anything with regulators. Farmers are the first ones who hate regulations. However, in reality, it's it's a framework we need to really understand. A, B, we need to engage, and C, we need to really make sure that we talk the same language when we actually talk to these regulators. Because whether it is in Montreal, in Virginia, or in Edinburgh, I mean, the same conversations need to be aligned. Because the interesting part is, they kind of like what we do. I mean, they don't say that this is nonsense. I mean, you will never get not the opportunity to speak to somebody. I mean, David Farquhar from IGS was at Downing Street 10. I mean, this shows they open the doors for you. They really do. But we need to have the ask and how, and we need to be really clear about this.
I think that's a really solid breakdown. Mark, what challenges do you see our industry facing especially? Mute
again. Sorry, I was going to say, I just want to check with Tinia, because it looked like you were about to jump in there. Were you about to jump in and say something?
I'll go after you because you have something that's probably more interesting than what I'm going to say.
No pressure. Good. Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about challenges, it's hard to pick out, from the many that exist. But if we're talking about challenges, I think really we're talking about cost, right? And this is where I think there's a bridge between what Andrew was saying and what Tom was saying. The energy is a part of your operational cost, right? And we still have this ongoing problem of, facilities that cost 11 to 10 bajillion dollars to build, and, the lack of sustainable finance models and business models and all of these questions. And all of those ultimately pertain to these questions that Tom and Andrew are raising around, if we're going to have nutritional security be a thing that we're aiming at, then we have to bring the cost of the produce down, so it's not just a nice thing that people with lots of money can have, right? And if we're going to bring the operational cost down, one of the ways we might look at doing that is through something like automation, say. But if we're going to have more automation, then we need to be careful about what claims we're making about workforce development. There could be good jobs there in developing automated solutions, good high-paying jobs, and that may be where we want to go. But all of these things are all tied together. But ultimately, if this thing is really going to scale, and especially if it's going to hybridize with, planting out into greenhouse or out into the field, or these kind of questions, we've got to get these cost elements under control and be clear about what they are and how they are limiting access and limiting what we can do, both in terms of cost to the end consumer and in terms of barriers to entry into the market for new growers who want to come in but are struggling to get in there because they don't have access to capital to build farms. Whatever that might be, we've got to start bringing those costs down, and that means the emergence of standards, it means the emergence of interoperability, it means engaging with policy and regulation and food safety and all of these different things, right, in order to eventually produce a scalable industry that gets those economies of scale and therefore gets its costs down and opens up all these other possibilities for things that at the moment we can't do.
Yeah, and cost of goods sold is a very important piece of the puzzle. And one of my favorite terms is unit economics. And I think that that's something that we cannot overlook, no matter how cool, sexy, sleek some of these operations are. We have to look at the data, and unit economics is it can be a challenge in this space with some of the more high-tech operations. Tinia, why don't you finish us off with the category of challenges?
Yes, let's bring it home. So I think what everyone has said, and Thomas and Andrew were in a really good conversation before we started talking about energy and co-location. And I know Mark has an appreciation for just really looking at progressive ways for whether it's energy recovery or on-site storage. And the only way to really catalyze that or activate that is by sharing that data with utilities. And with utilities having that baseline, they know, okay, here's the right way to either open up, and we'll kind of talk about this in one of your questions later, Kyle, is open up these specific areas based on the competitive industrial energy pricing in that region, that it makes the most sense for a vertical farm or a CEA operator. And similarly, those same utility providers need to have access so they can do sub-metering, right? So here in New York State, we have National Grid that's having these conversations and really being collaborative so that they can get the data needed to know how to either provide incentive programs for the operators to help with the energy management, or incentivize technologies that can provide on-site recovery, on-site storage of energy. And on the regulator side, I really just think, and Thomas mentioned this earlier, they're looking for examples. They're looking for tangible, let's say, templates, if possible, so that they know, okay, we have two really big, intimidating sectors, agriculture and energy, that needs to have innovation so that we can serve and be able to expand the market in a CEA fashion. But in order to do that, we need to have a protocol or a template to know exactly what are the costs, the unit economics going into it, for us to have more of a collaborative, more synergistic conversation between energy and our producers. And until that collaboration happens, which is data exchange, it's just going to make it a very long hill battle. So that would be my last kind of takeaway.
And collaboration, I mean, it's a fantastic word to use to close up challenges of the industry, because we talk about, energy and agriculture, and the regulation, and the need to really bring all of those parties together. And I think when we say collaboration, it's also important to look at inside the industry. Over at the States, at least, a lot of these companies are siloing their information, and I understand it's their IP, but collaboration is a challenge that I see, siloing from both inside and outside the industry. So I'm really happy, Tinia, that you finished with the word collaboration, because that is a huge challenge from every dimension. And it's something that having more dialogues just like this, having more open dialogues, is really going to solve that problem. So I want to bring it back to Andrew, because we're going to talk a bit about automation. And I know IGS does a lot of more automated approach, vertical farming, high tech. So when we look at automation, where do you see this coming? We talk a lot in this about, wow, this great benefit of this industry is creating jobs. And Tom talked about, when we speak to regulators, it's workforce development. But then the one of the elephants in the room is, okay, but then we talk about, very extensive automation, which in essence could remove jobs. So I want to get your take on the whole paradigm of automation, the value there, the threats. Just talk to us a bit about automation.
Automation is inevitable in any industry that could use tech. I'm reminded of, perhaps I'm old enough to have seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, and picking up a bone and starting to use an implement, and whether it's apes or humanoids, pretty much from that moment on, we started to apply technology. And so the adoption by humans of technology to make their lives better is an inevitable thing, and that is obviously true in agriculture. My sister is a great family tree historian, so she's into our ancestry, and I once discovered that one of my ancestors got deported from England, I stress he was English, to Australia for taking part in a threshing riot when the threshing machines were introduced. So are we going to see riots as we put more automation onto the farm? Probably not. Not in the UK right now anyway, because again, courtesy of Brexit in particular, we don't have enough agricultural workers. So the problem is not that these agricultural jobs are going to be replaced. It is that there actually just is insufficient talent. Very close to me here last summer, notoriously a farmer had to trash their entire crop of blueberries because there was nobody here to pick them. So automation, I think, is inevitable. As with any automation, there is a cost-benefit trade-off just in terms of what is it doing to the crop, what's it doing to the profitability of growing that crop for the farmer, does it make any impact on the quality of that crop for the consumer, does it shorten or extend the shelf life, and other considerations like that. Fundamentally, though, the world of growing plants and growing plants for food in the context of today's discussion is going to become more automated. I will stress again, though, that the type of CEA technology that we're discussing here is only at the very beginning of scratching the dent of the problem of solving for food insecurity or feeding the world, if you want to take it to a completely altruistic level. So I think automation, and whether that is robotic type automation, whether that's data automation that we touched on earlier around some of the waste discussion, for example, I'm viewing them all as opportunities for society, for humans who want to work either in this industry or in an adjacent one. For the most part, humans tend to shy away from the harder toil of the dirt under the fingernails jobs. So I think the digital farmer will have less dirt under their fingernails for the foreseeable future, but not necessarily no dirt. So I in developed countries, I think automation will move at reasonable pace. It needs to be appropriate. We think really carefully about adding the cost of another widget into our machine. Does this really add value? Does it really drive consistency, or is it just another sensor that's drawing yet more kilowatt hours of electricity for providing limited incremental value or perhaps no incremental value? So appropriate levels that work empathetically with the rest of the system, that deliver clear benefit to the consumer, whether that consumer is the farmer or the person who ultimately consumes the produce that the farmer grows.
It's a great breakdown of automation, and as you said in that one of the final points of the widget and making sure there's utility there. It's one of the pieces of advice I always give is, if you're collecting data or utilizing these things, make sure it has a purpose. If you're collecting data and it's just going into a bucket and you're not analyzing that data and making adjustments accordingly, there's no purpose in it. It's just a tangled web. So keeping these things organized and utilizing everything that you embrace when it comes to automation and data is incredibly important. Tinia, what are your thoughts on automation in our industry?
Yeah, I appreciate your question, Kyle. I think, my very brief take on this would be, if automation alleviates very mundane tasks that enhances or strengthens a farm's capabilities to predict sooner, and therefore by prediction, that enables them to prevent. So whether it's disease, whether it's pest outbreak, then I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But really honing in on what Andrew had mentioned, it definitely has to prove the value sooner rather than later, and it has to be part of what would be just the unit economics that's going to add more value to the consumer. So what I mean by that is just overall crop quality and or nutrition. That's what I kind of pay attention to. I see there being a lot of need for more innovation there, but I still think that a lot of the solutions are still very disparate, and they're not working with the existing kind of tech stack that is predominantly being used in the industry. So hopefully there's more solutions there.
Thank you. Mark, thoughts on automation for us?
Oh, not muted this time. Genuinely not, hopefully. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I totally agree with what Tinia was saying there about automation. I think there's a thing about scale with automation. I guess that's what I'd like to talk about here in terms of automation. I think a very clever friend and colleague of mine defines it as the difference between a farm robot and a robot farm. And I think that's kind of the key piece, right? Is that are we talking here about kind of, hectare scale greenhouses, at which case you're talking, and some of the speakers today have been talking about this as well, or are we talking about a thing that can do an individual task in a, you know, in a small farm somewhere, right? I think there's definitely a need to be much more clear what we mean when we talk about automation, because again, it's one of those words that's vast and covers a multitude of sins. And I think, you know, we need to be, very clear about what that means. And if we are then automating away low paid, mundane tasks, you know, I don't know if this is a phrase everywhere, but certainly here in Scotland around the oil industry, there's been a lot of talk of the just transition, right? If we're automating away or otherwise getting rid of jobs in a particular sector, are we making sure that we're adequately, you know, looking after those people who have lost jobs because we've automated? Now, as Andrew says, in the case of, like, you know, Brexit, where we haven't had people to pick farms, well, automating that away isn't necessarily so much a problem, because if there isn't a person doing it, then that's, you know, then fine. Okay, to a certain extent, we can do that. But, you know, in a lot of cases, I think we need to be careful of that. So, yeah, questions of scale and questions of what happens to people who were previously doing jobs that we automate away. Those are the two key points for me, I think.
And I'm happy you brought up, like, defining this and having a clear definition, because you can think of monitoring systems. I mean, using AI and camera technology, in essence, is that a part of automation? Andrew, did you have a point that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just picking up on the very last thing Mark said there, in that if we are going to automate away people's jobs, and whether that's by enabling us to grow things locally in the wintertime, then we perhaps should consider where those jobs are, because they may well be at the other end of a very long supply chain. And you know, there are economies in the world that have built an agricultural system to export, and to export potentially over some very massive distances. I think there is an inevitability that there will be a trend to deglobalize and relocalize, but we should also consider the ethics of putting a Kenyan farmer out of business because we no longer buy his beans, or a Chilean blueberry grower, to use my earlier example, if I find an alternative way of getting blueberries on my muesli in December.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the time here. We have about 8 minutes left, Tom. And if you bear with me, I'm going to pass a new question off to you so that we have time, about 2 minutes for each person to finish us off. And that's my favorite question about future predictions. I mean, where do you see the industry headed? What are your predictions for the future of indoor farming? And then I ask all participants to keep an eye on the clock to keep your response to about 2 minutes for this question.
Yeah, shortly, you know, we will be part of large-scale green infrastructure in the foreseeable future. I would say the next 5 to 10 years. There's no doubt in my mind. What I really think is the best part about really thinking about how we can actually do this is to think about that we need to create a profile for our profession, because it is agriculture, but agriculture is so outdated, it's so undesirable, has such a bad image. And we could really actually create a profession, you know, similar to what happened in manufacturing, called mechatronics, which is a merging between electronics and mechanical, skills. Going back a little bit about automation, also, just to finish this off, I think, you know, we have certainly a challenge in agriculture for many decades, that nobody wants to work in agriculture because it's dangerous, it's low wage, and it is not really, there's no knowledge transfer to really explain to you what you're doing. And I think automation will be, not like in other industries, will be helping in the agriculture communities to adopt technology that they are not going to be able to just simply do because they have access to cheap labor. And that, I think, is a real interesting hinge on this idea for automation. Why? And does it actually mean we really reduce the ability to actually hire people? I think in our industry, it will actually increase the workforce. Simple as that.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Tom. Mark, would love to hear your predictions for the future.
I guess I could summarize it in two main words, which are integration and hybridization. Right. This is we're very for as long as I've been around this industry, we've been talking about how vertical farming, indoor farming, CEA is one tool in the box. That's fine, but up to now, it's generally been the case that we have focused on that one tool and the things it can do. What we're looking at now, and the big story of the next few years for me, is how this industry integrates and hybridizes with everything else, right? How it fits together with other parts of the food system and the energy system, and all of these different things, and how all those jigsaw pieces fit together into ultimately what we hope will be a more sustainable and resilient society, for want of a better word, really. I think so. I'll keep it short and sweet and keep it to that for now, but that's where I think this is all going. And also space farming and farms on Mars.
I love it. Got to always add that in.
Yeah.
Tinia, what are your predictions for the future?
Yeah, I like the two-word approach that Mark said. So I would say distribution and collaboration. And what I mean by that specifically is distributed food production, largely in industrial parks or where there's competitive pricing on many different resources. But what I'd almost love to see is growers that have a best of practice. So whether it's strawberries, collaborating with leafy greens, collaborating with, cannabis, hemp, whatever, and they form a brand or just a conglomerate that really integrates everyone's capabilities that have optimized for resources in the best way possible. And if doing so, then I really kind of see a distributed regional hub where food can be produced, different crop types, and everyone's benefiting from the input costs or the natural resource costs in a much more efficient way. So would love to see that. Hopefully that comes into fruition.
Thank you. I love it. All right, Andrew, why don't you finish us off with your predictions for the future of this industry?
So I'm going to accept the two-word challenge. So one is definitely going to be a prediction, and that's going to be around evolution. And possibly a plea for the second one around us making a resolution. So firstly, I agree with Thomas. This needs to get to scale. I'd mentioned that earlier, and I do believe that this needs to be part of a green infrastructure. So 100% agree with Thomas's comment. I think over the next possibly 2 years, maybe even less, the evolution will be happening. And the evolution I see happening is around the business models. The business model that is clearly failing for many is growing leafy greens, building your own tech, and then attempting to make enough money to repay that investment by operating it yourself. So I think we will see, as with every technology business, we will see an evolution where growers will buy tech and deliver proof that you can consistently grow great plants and make money. And with that proof, we will see an evolution of business models. So banks will start to lend. We may see, to accelerate the infrastructure, people coming in as infrastructure players to deliver farms or farming as a service, and possibly accepting outcome-based business models in the same way that you can now do that again with solar or wind generation, or even the turbines that keep our planes in the sky. I do expect to see more co-location over the short term anyway, in terms of electricity generation, alongside CEA, to be able to cope with both the price of the kilowatt hour, but also the price volatility. We spoke about that at some length earlier. And at the risk of going back through what Tinia said, I think we also need to make a resolution to collaborate and to share consistent data, as opposed to distorting the truths to support a marketing narrative that may not be supported by the facts. So I will leave you with that thought. I think there will be an evolution of business model over the next 2 years. Hopefully we get to enough scale over the next 5. In order to credibly do that, we need to take the resolution that I outlined. If I look beyond the 5-year horizon, my ambition is that we really do start to tackle the waste problem. I think the waste problem is going to require an integration and fusion of technology with the sciences of crop science and data science, but it will only work when there is enough scale to make an impact in the value chain. And getting back to a phrase I've used already today, which is beginning to scratch the surface of the dent in the problem.
I love it. It's great summarization as well of a lot of the points brought up on the future predictions. We're out of time. Unfortunately, no time for questions, but I really want to thank all of the panelists. Fantastic job. Lots of golden nuggets here. We did this very similar subject last year, very similar questions, entirely different discussion. So I think that's really special. A lot of great points. So once again, thank you for participating in this panel, and I hope to see you out in the industry, out in the greenhouse or the vertical farm sometime soon.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a good.
Great. And just on that note, I want to say thank you ever so much for the panelists for taking part, for you being such a good host of the session, Kyle, Tinia, Andrew, Thomas, and Mark. Yeah, thank you for finishing 2023 with such an interesting insight into the development work ongoing and the state of the industry. And it leads me to also thank our esteemed co-chairpersons for the event. They've done a sterling job over 2 days. Lots of busyness behind the scenes and really facilitating the speakers very well. So thank you very much to Mark Haller and Derek Stewart. And I also want to thank all the participants. We've had over 700 participants this year, which has been great. And through that, we've had a great over 50 presenters, many exhibitors, and they've given some really useful information with regard to the insight solutions that are being developed across the industry. So thank you once again. And just so you know, you can continue to access and use the event platform to chat and message with any of the attendees for the next 2 weeks. And access to the recordings of the presentations will be in every attendee's inbox by Monday. For those who have a public holiday on Monday, have a lovely long weekend. For those that don't, we'll be thinking of you. So thank you very much for your time once again. And I wish you all a happy remainder for 2023 for indoor agriculture farming.